I was standing in a makeshift room at New York, Presbyterian Morgan Stanley Children's Hospital with a couple dozen people. Some of them were young children battling cancer, others were family and friends there to spend time with them. There was a handful of hospital staff. Spread out across the room were a young woman unknowingly about to get a scholarship, a social worker who had paid for a child's cable bill so that he could have some comfort in his last few weeks of life, and team members of a charity who had brought everyone there so that sick children could have a little bit of fun for a few hours. It was an event that was both solemn and uplifting, and it was all centered around video games. GameChanger charity is a group that, in a way, got its start in 2006. Taylor Carroll was an 11-year-old living in Southern California, son to a tech CEO and part of a family that was heavily involved in sports. One day, he broke his elbow playing baseball, which wasn't a big deal until a few weeks later, when doctors noticed his arm wasn't healing at all. A blood test showed that his white blood cell count was 23 times higher than it should have been, and a diagnosis of leukemia came in short order. We were lost. We were confused. We were angry, Taylor told me. Soon after the diagnosis, the Carrolls moved to Seattle in hopes that Taylor would be accepted into an experimental treatment program. After he received a bone marrow transplant, Taylor had to be isolated to make sure he didn't contract any illness while his immune system was depleted and while they waited for the transplant to take. The only people allowed to enter Taylor's room were doctors and nurses in hazmat suits. It took 21 days for his transplant to engraft, around a week longer than what's expected, but Taylor still wasn't out of the woods. Unfortunately, he developed graft-versus-host disease, which is caused by the transplanted bone marrow seeing its new body as foreign and rejecting it. Taylor had to spend 6 more months in isolation while he fought to stay alive. During that time, Taylor and his family were looking for any source of stability they could find. We found that through faith, we found that through friends, and, most importantly, we found that through gaming, he said. Video games let Taylor escape his quarantined room and provided him with a little taste of normalcy, as he said. He could hop onto the hospital phone and brag to his friends about his Crash Bandicoot time or complain about how hard a certain level of remission was. And he said the effect was the same for other kids in his hospital. Once he was out of isolation and could see other children, he said, the kids who could play games were so happy. And, Taylor told me, games were able to create moments between these kids, many of whom were in awkward preteen years, that allowed for conversations about fear, loss, grief and confusion that otherwise were hard to have. And as his dad, Jim Carroll, pointed out, most of the games available were incredibly outdated. They were playing Nintendo 64s in 2012, but it didn't matter, even old technology allowed for a necessary escape. That's how it all started, said Jim. While Taylor was still in the hospital, he and Jim realized that almost everyone has some old video gaming equipment sitting around gathering dust. Although at first Jim turned to games in order to help Taylor, he quickly realized that this was something that could be done on a much larger scale.